Looks like a simple machine, but many people don't understand it, or they don't agree on how it works. I feel a lot of needless economic suffering. I feel a deep sense of responsibility to share my simple but practical economic template. Though it's conventional, it has helped me to anticipate and to sidestep for global finances crisis, and it's worked well for me for over 30 years. Let's begin. Though the economy might seem complex, it works in a simple mechanical way. It's made up of few simple parts and a lot of simple transactions that repeat over and over again zillion times. These transactions are above all else driven by human nature, and they create three main forces in drive the economy. Number one, productivity growth. Number two, the short-term debt cycle. And number three, the long-term debt cycle. Well, look at these three forces, how ranked them on the top of which are to create a good template of tracking economic movements and figuring out what's happening now. Let's start with the simplest part of the economy, transactions. An economy is simply the sum of the transactions that make it up, and the transactions is a very simple thing. You make transactions all the time. Every time you buy something, you create the transactions. Each transaction consists of a buyer exchanging money or credit with the seller for goods, services, or financial assets. Credit spends just like money, so adding together the money expend, the amount of credit expend, you can know the total spending. The total amount of spending is drive the economy. If you divide the amount spent by the quantity sold, you get the price, and that's it. That's a transaction. It's a building block the economy machine. All cycles, all processes in economy driven by transactions. So if we can understand transactions, we can understand the whole economy. A market consists of all the buyers, all the sellers, and making transactions is for the same thing. For example, there is a wheat market, a car market, a stock market. A market is millions of things. An economy consists of all the transactions in all of the market. If you add up the total spending, the total quantity sold, and all of the market, your everything needs to know understand the economy. It's just simple. People, businesses, banks, and government all engage in transactions as we just described, exchanging money and credit for goods, services, and financial assets. The biggest buyer and seller is the government, which consists of two important parts: a central government that collects taxes and spends money, and a central bank, which is different from other buyers and sellers because it controls the amount of money and credit in the economy. It does this by influencing interest rates and printing new money. For these reasons, as we see, the central bank is an important player in the flow of credit. I want you to pay attention to credit. Credit is the most important part of the economy and probably the least understood. It's the most important part of it because it's the biggest and most valuable part. Just like buyers and sellers go to the market to make transactions, so the lenders and borrowers. Lenders usually want to make their money into more money, and borrowers usually want to buy something they can't afford, like a house or a car, or they want to invest in something like starting a business. Credit can help both lenders and borrowers get what they want. The borrowers promise to repay the amount they borrow, called principal, plus an additional amount called interest. When interest rates are high, there is less borrowing because it's expensive. When interest rates are low, borrowing increases because it's cheaper. When borrowers promise to repay and lenders believe them, credit is created. Any two people can agree to credit out of thin air. Create credit out of thin air. That's tricky because it has different names. As soon as credit is created, it immediately turns into debt. Debt is both an asset to the lender and a liability to the borrower. In the future, when the borrower will pay the loan plus interest, the asset and the liability disappear and the transaction is settled. So why is credit so important? Because when a borrower receives credit, he is able to increase his spending. And remember, spending drives the economy. This is because one person's spending is another person's income. Think about it. Every dollar you spend someone else owns, and every dollar you earn, someone else has spent. So when you spend more, someone else owns more. When someone's income rises, it makes lenders more willing to lend them in money because as is now not more worthy of credit. A creditworthy borrower has to think. Ability to repay and collateral. Having a lot of income relations to his repay. In the event that he can repay or pay as valuable assets to use as collateral that can be sold. This makes lenders feel comfortable lending him money. So increased incomes allows increased borrowing, which allows increased spending. And since one person's spending is another person's income, this leads to more increased borrowing and so on. But this self-reinforcing pattern leads to economic growth and is why we have cycle. In a transaction, you have to give something in order to get something, and how much you get to depends on how much you produce. Over time, we learn and not accumulating knowledge raises our living standard. We call this productivity growth. Those who are inventive and hardworking raises their productivity and their living standards faster than those who are complacent and lazy. But that is necessarily true of a short run. Productivity now and most long run, credit matters in short run. This is because productivity growth doesn't fluctuate much, so it's not a big drives economy swings. That is because it allows and consume or reproduce in more quality, and it first consume or less in produce when you have to pay back. Debt swings in two big cycles. One takes 5 years and the other takes 75 to 100 years. While most people feed swings that typically do cycles because see them too up close day by day, week by week. And this chapter we're going to step back, look at these three big forces and how they interacting make up experience. As mentioned, the swings around the rod are not due to how much innovation or hard work there is. They are primarily due to how much credit there is. Let's for a second imagine an economy without credit. In the second economy, the only way increases my spending, this is increases my income, which quality will productivity and do more work. Increased productivity is the only way for growth, since my spending is another person's income. The economy grows every time I or anyone else is more productive. If we follow the transactions and play this out, we see a progression like the productivity grow right. But because we borrow, we have cycled. This isn't due to any laws or regulation. It's due to human nature and the way the credit works. Think of borrowing as simply a way of pulling spending forward. In order to buy something you can afford, you need to spend more than you make. To do this, you essentially need to borrow from your future self. And doing so increases time in the future that you need to spend less than make in order to pay it back. It very quickly resembles a cycle. Basically, anytime you borrow, you create a cycle. This is true for an individual as it is for the economy. This is why understanding credit is so important because it sets into motion a mechanical, predictable series of events that will happen in the future. This makes credit different from money. Money is zero transactions with. When you buy a beer from a bartender with cash, the transaction is zero immediately. But when you buy a beer with credit, it's like starting a bartag. You're saying you promise to pay in the future. Together, you and the bartender created an asset and a liability. You just created credit out of thin air. It's not until you pay the bartender later that the asset and the liability disappear, the debt goes away, and the transaction settles. The reality is that most of what people call money is actually credit. The total amount of credit in the United States is about $50 trillion. and the total amount of money is only about $3 trillion. Remember, in an economy without credit, the only way to increase your spending is to produce more. But in an economy with credit, you can also increase your spending by borrowing. As a result, an economy with credit has more spending and allows incomes to rise faster. It better than productivity over the short run, but not over the long run. Don't get me wrong, credit isn't necessarily something bad that just causes cycles. It's bad when finance is overconsumption that can't be paid back. However, it's good when it efficiently allocates a resource of income. But not over the long run. Don't get me wrong. Credit is necessarily something bad that just causes cycle. It's bad when finance is overconsumption that can be paid back. However, it's good when it eventually allocate resources and produce income so you can pay back to them. For example, if you borrow money to buy a big TV, if it doesn't generate income for you to pay back the debt. But if you borrow money to buy a tractor, and the tractor lets you harvest more crops and earn more money, then you can pay back your debt and improve your living standard. In an economy with credit, we can follow the transactions. We see how credit creates growth. Let me give you an example. Suppose you earn $100,000 a year and have no debt. You are creditworthy enough to borrow $10,000, say, on a credit card. So you can spend $110,000 even though you only earn $100,000. Since your spending is another person's income, someone is earning $110,000. The person earning $110,000 with no debt can borrow $11,000, so he can spend $121,000 even though he has only earned $110,000. His spending is another person's income, and by following the transactions, we can begin to see how this process works in a self-reinforcing pattern. But remember, borrowing creates cycle. And if the cycle goes up, it eventually needs to come down. This leads us into the short-term debt cycle. As economic activity increases, we see an expansion, the first phase of the short-term debt cycle. Spending continues to increase and prices to rise. This is happens because the increase in spending is fueled by credit, which can be credit instead out of thin air. When the amount of spending and incomes grow faster than the production of goods, prices rise. When prices rise, we call this inflation. The central bank doesn't want too much inflation because it causes problems. Seeing prices rise, it raises interest rates. With higher interest rates, fewer people can afford to borrow money, and the cost of existing debt rises. Think about this as the monthly payments on your credit card going up. Because people borrow less and have higher debt repayments, they have less money left over to spend. So spending slows. And since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes drop, and so on and so forth. When people spend less prices go down. We call this deflation. Economic activity decreases and we have a recession. If the recession becomes too severe and inflation is no longer a problem, the central bank will lower interest rates to cause everything to pick up again. With low interest rates, debt repayments are reduced and borrowing and spending pick up. And this is another expansion. As you can see, the economy works like a machine. In the short-term debt cycle, spending is constrained only by the willingness of lenders and borrowers to provide and receive credit. When credit is easily available, there is an economic expansion. When credit isn't easily available, there's a recession. And note that this cycle is controlled primarily by the central bank. The short-term debt cycle typically lasts 5 to 8 years and happens over and over again for decades. But notice that the bottom and the top of each cycle finish with more growth in the previous cycle and with more debt. Why? Because people push it. They have an inclination to borrow and spend more instead of paying back debt. It's human nature. Because of this, over long periods of time, debts rise faster than incomes. created the long-term debt cycle. Despite people becoming more in debt, lenders even more purely extend credit. Why? Because everyone thinks things are going great. People are just focused on what's been happening lately. And what's been happening lately? Incomes have been rising. Asset values are going up. The stock market rose. It's a boom. It pays to buy goods, services, and financial assets with borrowed money. And people do a lot of that. We call it a bubble. So we do that have been growing. Incomes have been growing nearly as fast to offset them. Let's call the ratio of debt to income the debt burden. So long as income continues to rise, the debt burden stays manageable. At the same time, asset value is lower. People borrow huge amounts of money to buy assets in asset investments, causing their prices to rise even higher. People feel wealthy. So even the accumulation of lots of debt, rising incomes, and asset values helps borrowers remain creditworthy for a long time. But this obviously cannot continue forever, and it doesn't. Over decades, debt burdens slowly increases, creating large debt repayments. At some point, debt repayments start growing faster than incomes, forcing people to cut back on their spending. And since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes begin to go down, which makes people less creditworthy, causing borrowing to go down. Debt repayments continue to rise, which makes spending drop even further, and the cycle reverses itself. This is the long-term debt peak. Debt burdens have simply become too big. For the United States, Europe, and much of the rest of the world, this happened in 2008. It happened for the same reason it happened in Japan in 1989 and in the United States back in 1929. Now the economy begins deleveraging. In the deleveraging, people cut spending, incomes fall, credit disappear, asset price drop, banks get squeezed. The stock market crashes, social tensions rise, and the whole thing starts to feed on itself the other way. As incomes fall and debt repayments rise, borrowers get squeezed. No longer creditworthy, credit drives up, and borrowers can no longer borrow enough money to make their debt repayments. Scrambling to fill this hole, borrowers are proceed to sell assets. The rush to sell assets flows the market at the same time as spending falls. This is when the stock market collapses. The real estate market tanks and banks get into trouble. As asset prices drop, the value of the collateral borrowers can put up drop. This is borrower even less creditworthy. People fear poor credit. Either credit rapidly disappears. Less spending, less income, less wealth, less credit, less borrowing, and so on. It's a vicious cycle. This feels similar to recession, but the difference here is that interest rates can't be lower to save the debt. In a recession, lowering interest rates works to stimulate borrowing. However, in deleveraging, lowering interest rates doesn't work because interest rates are already low and soon hit 0%. So the stimulation ends. Interest rates in the United States hit 0% during the deleveraging of the 1930s and again in 2008. The difference between a recession and a deleveraging is that in a deleveraging, borrowers' debt burdens have simply got too big and can't be relieved by lowering interest rates. Lenders realize that debt have become to pay back. Borrowers have lost their ability to repay and their collateral has lost value. They feel crippled by the debt. They don't even want more. Lenders stop lending, borrowers stop borrowing. Think of the economy as being not creditworthy, just like an individual. So what do you do about deleveraging? The problem is that burdens are too high and they must come down. There are 4 ways this can happen. 1. People, businesses, and governments cut their spending. 2. Debts reduced to defaults and restructuring. 3. Wealthy redistribute from the haves to the have-nots. And finally, 4. The central bank printing new money. These 4 ways have been helped in everyday levels in modern history. Usually, spending is cut first. As you just saw, people, businesses, and even governments tighten their belts and cut their spending so that they can pay down their debt. This is often referred to as charity. When borrowers stop taking on new debts and start paying down old debt, you might expect the debt burden to decreases, but the upside happens because spending is cut. One man's spending is another man's income. It causes incomes to fall. They fall faster than debts are repaid, and the debt burden actually gets worse. As we've seen, this cut in spending is deflationary and painful. Businesses are forced to cut costs, which means less jobs and higher unemployment. This leads to the next step. Debt must be reduced. Many borrowers find themselves unable to repay their loans, and the borrower's debt are lenders' asset. When a borrower doesn't repay the bank, people get nervous that the bank won't be able to repay them, so they rush to withdraw their money from the bank. Banks squeeze when people, businesses, and banks default on their debt. This severe economic contraction is a depression. A big part of the depression is people discovering much of what they thought was their wealth is still early there. Let's go back to the bar. When you borrow in a bottle of beer, you promise to repay the bartender. Your promise became an asset of the bartender. But if you break your promise, if you don't pay him back and essentially default on your bartender, and the asset he has isn't really worth you anything. It has basically disappeared. Many lenders don't want their asset to disappear and agree to debt restructuring. Debt restructuring means lenders get paid back less or get paid back over a longer time frame or at a lower interest rate than was first agreed. Somehow a contract is broken in a way that reduces debt. Lenders would rather have a little of something than all of nothing. Even though debt disappears, debt restructuring causes income and asset value to disappear faster. So the debt burden continues to get worse. Like cutting spending, debt reduction is also painful and deflationary. All of this impact the central government because lower incomes and less employment means the government collects fewer taxes. At the same time, it needs to increase its spending because employment has risen. Many of the employed have inadequate savings and need financial support from governments. Additionally, government's credit stimulus plan and increases their spending to make up for the decreases in the economy. Government's budget deficits explode in the leverage because they spend more than they earn in taxes. This is what's happening when you hear about the deficit on the news. The raise taxes or borrow money. But with income poor and so many unemployed, who is the money going to come from? The rich. Since government needs more money and since wealth is heavily concentrated in hands of a small percentage of the people, government naturally raise taxes on the wealthy, which facilitates a redistribution of wealth in the economy. For the haves to the have-nots, but have-nots who are suffering begin to resent the wealthy haves. The wealthy haves being squeezed by the weak economy, falling asset prices, and higher taxes begin to resent the have-nots. If the depression continues, social disorder can break out. Not only the tensions rise within countries, they can rise between countries, especially incredible countries. This situation can lead to political change that can sometimes be extreme. In the 19th century, this led to Hitler coming to power, war in Europe, and depression in the United States. The pressure to do something to end the depression increases. Remember, most of what people thought was money was actually credit. So when credit disappears, people don't have enough money. People are despaired for money, and you remember who can print money? Central bank can. Having already lowered its interest rates to nearly zero, it's forced to print money. Unlike cutting spending, debt reduction, and wealth redistribution, printing money is inflationary and stimulus. Inevitably, and central bank prints new money out of thin air and uses it to buy financial assets and government bonds. It happened in the United States during the Great Depression and again in 2000 when the United States Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, printed over $2 trillion. Other central banks around the world that could print a lot of money too. By buying financial assets with this money, it helps drive up asset prices, which makes people more creditworthy. However, this only helps those who own financial assets. You see, the central bank can print money, but it can only buy financial assets. The central government, on the other hand, can buy goods and services and put money in the hands of the people, but it can't print money. So in order to stimulate the economy, the two must cooperate. By buying government bonds, the central bank essentially lends money to the government, allowing it to loan a deficit and increases spending on goods and services through its stimulus programs and unemployment benefits. This increases people's income as well as the government's debt. However, it will lower the economy's total debt burden. This is a very risky time. Policymaker needs to balance the poor ways the debt burdens come down. The deflationary waves need to balance with the inflationary waves in order to maintain stability. If balanced correctly, there can be a beautiful deleveraging. You see, a deleveraging can be ugly or it can be beautiful. How can I deleverage be beautiful?